The Story of Civilization, Volume 5, The Renaissance, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 1, Side 2. Verona, in Petrarch's time, might have been classed among the major powers of Italy. Proud of her antiquity and her Roman theater, where one may still of a summer evening hear opera under the stars, enriched by the trade that came over the Alps and down the Adige, Verona rose under the Scala family to a height where she threatened the commercial supremacy of Venice. After the death of the terrible Ezzolino in 1260, the commune chose Mastino della Scala as podesta. Mastino was assassinated in due course in 1277, but his brother and successor Alberto firmly established the rule of the Scaligeri, ladder-bearers, from the apt emblem of a climbing family, and inaugurated the heyday of Verona's history. During his reign, the Dominicans began to build the lovely church of Sant'Anastasia. An obscure copyist unearthed the lost poems of Catullus, Verona's most famous son, and the Guelph family of the Cappelletti fought the Ghibelline family of the Montecchi, never dreaming that they would become Shakespeare's Capulets and Montagues. The strongest and not the least noble of the Scala despots was Congrande della Scala, who made his court an asylum for exiled Ghibellines and a haven for poets and scholars. There Dante, for several years, indignantly climbed the shaky stairs of patronage. But Congrande brought Vicenza, Padua, Treviso, Belluno, Feltre, and Cividale under his power. Venice saw herself threatened with a strangling encirclement. When Congrande was succeeded by the less ardent Mastino II, she declared war, brought in Florence and Milan as her allies, and forced Verona to surrender all but one of the conquered towns. Congrande II built the majestic Scaligeri Bridge over the Adige, with an arch whose span of 160 feet was then the largest in the world. He was assassinated by his brother, Consignorio, who followed this fratricide with a wise and beneficent rule, and built the most ornate of the famous tombs of the Scaligers. His sons divided the throne and quarreled to the death, and in 1387 Verona and Vicenza were absorbed into the Duchy of Milan. 4. Rienzo's Revolution. Back in Avignon and Vaucluse, from 1345 to 1347, Petrarch, still enjoying the friendship of the Colonnas, rejoiced to hear that revolution had flared up in Rome, and that the son of a tavern-keeper and a washerwoman had deposed the Colonnas and other aristocrats from power, and had restored the glorious republic of the Scipios, the Gracchi, and Arnold of Brescia. Nicola di Rienzo Gabrini, known by the economy of popular speech as Cola di Rienzo, and by a careless posterity as Rienzi, had met Petrarch in 1343, when, as a young notary of 30 years' age, he had come to Avignon to acquaint Clement VI with the dire condition of Rome, and to solicit for the Roman people the support of the papacy against the feuding, marauding nobles who dominated the capital. Clement, though skeptical, had sent him back with encouragement in Florence, hoping to use the fervent lawyer in the recurrent conflict of the popes with the aristocracy. Rienzo, like Petrarch, had had his imagination fired by the ruins and classics of Rome. Dressed in the white toga of an ancient senator, and speaking with the ardor of the Gracchi and almost the eloquence of Cicero, he pointed to the remains of the majestic forums and colossal baths, and reminded the Romans of the time when consuls or emperors from these hills had given laws and order urbi et orbi to the city and to the world. And he challenged them to seize the government, to restore the popular assembly, and to elect a tribune strong enough to protect them against the usurping nobility. The poor listened in awe. Merchants wondered, might this potential tribune make Rome safe for industry and trade? Aristocrats laughed and made Rienzo the butt of their dinner jollity. He promised to hang a selection of them when the revolution came. To their consternation, it came. On May 20th, 1347, a concourse of Romans crowded to the capital. Rienzo appeared before them, escorted by the Bishop of Orvieto as vicar of the Pope. He proclaimed the restoration of the Republic and a distribution of alms. They elected him dictator, and at a later meeting allowed him to take the old popular title of tribune. The aged senator Stefano Colonna protested. Cola ordered him and the other nobles to leave the city. Furious, but respecting the armed revolutionaries, they withdrew to their country estates. Delirious with success, Rienzo began to speak of himself as the divinely inspired, illustrious Redeemer of the Holy Roman Republic by the authority of Jesus Christ. His administration was excellent. Food prices were regulated to check profiteering, surplus corn was stored in the granaries, work was begun to drain the malarial marshes and put the Campagna under cultivation. New courts dealt out justice with impartial severity. A monk and a baron were beheaded for equal felonies. A former senator was hanged for robbing a merchant vessel. The cutthroats hired by noble factions were arrested. A court of conciliation pacified in a few months 1,800 feuds. Aristocrats accustomed to being their own law were shocked to find themselves held responsible for crimes committed on their estates. Some paid heavy fines. Pietro Colonna, dripping dignity, was led on foot to jail. Judges guilty of malfeasance were exposed in public pillories. Peasants tilled their fields in unwonted security and peace. Merchants and pilgrims en route to Rome kissed the insignia of the resurrected republic that made the highways safe after half a century of brigandage. All Italy marveled at this intrepid transformation, and Petrarch raised to Rienzo a paean of gratitude and praise. Seizing his opportunity with bold statesmanship, the tribune dispatched envoys throughout the peninsula, inviting the cities to send representatives who would form a great parliament to unite and govern the whole of sacred Italy in a federation of municipalities, and to make Rome again the capital of the world. To a preliminary council of judges gathered from all Italy, he submitted a question. Might the Roman Republic, now reconstituted, rightfully reclaim all the privileges and powers that in its decay had been delegated to other authorities? Answered in the affirmative, Rienzo put through the popular assembly a law restoring to the Republic all such grants of power. This grandiose declaration, sweeping away a millennium of donations, abdications, and coronations, threatened alike the Holy Roman Empire, the autonomous cities, and the temporal power of the Church. 25 communes sent representatives to Rienzo's parliament, but the major city-states, Venice, Florence, Milan, hesitated to submit their sovereignty to a federation. Clement VI was pleased with the tribune's piety, his formal sharing of his authority with the Bishop of Orvieto, the protection he gave to pilgrims, the prospects he held out of a lucrative jubilee in 1350. But he began to wonder, was not this sanguine republican an impractical idealist who would outreach himself to ruin? Amazing and pitiful was the collapse of the noble dream. Power, like freedom, is a test that only a sober intelligence can meet. Rienzo was too great an orator to be a realistic statesman. He came to believe his own magnificent phrases, promises, and claims. He was poisoned by his own periods. When the Federative Assembly met in August 1347, he had arranged that it should begin by conferring knighthood upon him. That evening he proceeded with his escort to the baptistry of St. John Lateran, and plunged bodily into the great basin wherein, according to legend, Constantine had washed away his paganism and his sins. Then, clad in white, he slept through the night on a public couch set up amid the pillars of the church. On the morrow he issued to the assembly and the world a decree, declaring all the cities of Italy to be free, endowing them with Roman citizenship, and reserving exclusively to the people of Rome and Italy the authority to elect an emperor. Drawing his sword, he flourished it in 3 directions, saying, as the representative of Rome, "This belongs to me, and that." He now began to indulge in ostentatious extravagance. He rode about on a white horse under a royal banner, preceded by 100 armed men, and dressed in a white silk robe with fringes of gold. When Stefano Colonna twitted him about the gold fringe, he announced that the nobles were conspiring against him, which was probably true, ordered the arrest of several, had them led in chains to the Capitol, proposed to the assembly that they should be beheaded, relented, pardoned them, and ended by appointing them to offices of state in the Campagna. They rewarded him by raising a force of mercenaries against the Republic. The city's militia went out to meet them and defeated them, and Stefano Colonna and his son died in the battle on November 20th, 1347. Rienzo, exalted by success, more and more ignored and thrust aside the papal representative whom he had associated with himself in office and authority. Cardinals from Italy and from France warned Clement that a unified Italy, and much more an empire ruled from Rome, would make the Italian Church a prisoner of the state. On October 7th, Clement commissioned his legate Bertrand de Deux to offer Rienzo a choice between deposition and the restriction of his powers to the secular affairs of the city of Rome. After some resistance, Cola yielded. He promised obedience to the Pope and withdrew the edicts that had annulled imperial and papal privileges. Unmollified, Clement resolved to unseat the incalculable tribune. On December 3rd he published a bull stigmatizing Cola as a criminal and a heretic, and called upon the Romans to banish him. The legate suggested that if this should not be done, no jubilee would be proclaimed. Meanwhile, the nobles had raised another army, which now advanced upon Rome. Rienzo had the tocsin rung to call the people to arms. Only a few came. Many resented the taxes he had levied. Some preferred the profits of a jubilee to the responsibilities of freedom. As the forces of the aristocracy neared the capital, Rienzo's wonted courage waned. He discarded the insignia of his office, said goodbye to his friends, broke into tears, and shut himself up in the Castello Sant'Angelo on December 15th, 1347. The triumphant nobles re-entered their city palaces, and the papal legate named 2 of them as senators to rule Rome. Unmolested by the nobles, but still under the ban of the Church, Rienzo fled to Naples, and then to the mountain forests of the Abruzzi, near Sulmona. There he donned the garb of a penitent, and for 2 years lived as an anchorite. Then, surviving 1,000 hardships and tribulations, he made his way, secretly and in disguise, through Italy and the Alps and Austria to the Emperor Charles IV at Prague. He pronounced before him an angry indictment of the popes. To their absence from Rome he attributed the anarchy and poverty of that city, and to their temporal power and policy the abiding division of Italy. Charles rebuked him and defended the popes, but when Clement demanded that Cola be sent as a papal prisoner to Avignon, Charles kept him in protective confinement in a fortress on the Elbe. After a year of unbearable inactivity and isolation, Cola asked to be sent to the papal court. On his journey to Avignon, crowds flocked to see him, and gallant knights offered to guard him with their swords. On August 10th, 1352, he reached Avignon in such miserable raiment that all men pitied him. He asked for Petrarch, who was at Vaucluse. The poet responded by issuing to the people of Rome a clarion call to protect the man who had offered them liberty. To the Roman people, invincible conquerors of nations, your former tribune is now a captive in the power of strangers. And, a sad spectacle indeed, like a nocturnal thief or a traitor to his country, he pleads his cause in chains. The highest of earthly tribunals refuses him the opportunity of a legitimate defense. Rome assuredly does not merit such treatment. Her citizens, once inviolable by alien law, are now indiscriminately maltreated. And this is done not only without the guilt that attaches to a crime, but even with the high praise of virtue. He is accused not of betraying, but of defending liberty. He is guilty not of surrendering, but of holding the capital. The supreme crime with which he is charged, and which merits expiation on the scaffold, is that he dared affirm that the Roman Empire is still at Rome, and in possession of the Roman people. O impious age! O preposterous jealousy, malevolence without precedent! What dost thou, O Christ, ineffable and incorruptible judge of all? Where are thine eyes, with which thou art wont to scatter the clouds of human misery? Why dost thou not, with thy forked lightning, put an end to this unholy trial? Clement did not ask for Cola's death, but ordered him kept in custody in the tower of the papal palace at Avignon. While Rienzo studied Scripture and Livy there, a new tribune, Francesco Baroncelli, seized power in Rome, banished the nobles, flouted the papal legate, and allied himself with the Ghibelline supporters of the emperors against the popes. Clement's successor, Innocent VI, released Cola and sent him to Italy as an aide to Cardinal Albornoz, whom he charged with restoring the papal authority in Rome. As the subtle cardinal and the subdued dictator neared the capital, a revolt was staged. Baroncelli was deposed and killed, and the Romans turned the city over to Albornoz. The populace welcomed Rienzo with arches of triumph and joyful acclamations in crowded streets. Albornoz appointed him senator and delegated to him the secular government of Rome. This in 1353. But years of imprisonment had fattened the body, broken the courage, and dulled the mind of the once brilliant and fearless tribune. His policies cleaved to the papal line and shunned the grand emprises of his younger reign. The nobility still hated him, and the proletariat, seeing in him now a cautious conservative, cured of utopia, turned against him as disloyal to their cause. When the Colonna declared war upon him and besieged him in Palestrina, his unpaid troops verged on mutiny. He borrowed money to pay them, raised taxes to redeem the debt, and alienated the middle class. Hardly 2 months after his return to power, a revolutionary mob marched to the capital shouting, "Long live the people! Death to the traitor Cola di Rienzo!" He came out of his palace in knightly armor and tried to control the crowd with eloquence. But the rebels drowned his voice with noise and showered him with missiles. An arrow struck him in the head, and he withdrew into the palace. The mob set fire to the doors, broke through them, and plundered the rooms. Hiding in one of these, Rienzo hastily cut off his beard, donned a porter's cloak, and piled some bedding upon his head. Emerging, he passed through part of the crowd unrecognized. But his gold bracelet betrayed him, and he was led as a prisoner to the steps of the Capitol, where he himself had condemned men to death. He asked for a hearing, and began to move the people with his speech. But an artisan fearful of eloquence cut him short with a sword thrust in the stomach. 100 demi-heroes plunged their knives into his dead body. The bloody corpse was dragged through the streets and was hung up like carrion at a butcher's stall. It remained there 2 days, a target for public contumely and urchins' stones. 5. The Wandering Scholar. Rienzo failed to restore ancient Rome, which was dead to all but poetry. Petrarch succeeded in restoring Roman literature, which had never died. He had so openly supported Cola's revolt that he had forfeited the favor of the Colonna in Avignon. For a time he thought of joining Rienzo in Rome. He was as far on the way as Genoa when he heard that the tribune's position and conduct were deteriorating. He changed his course to Parma, this in 1347. He was in Italy when the Black Death came, taking many of his friends and killing Laura in Avignon. In 1343 he accepted the invitation of Jacopo II da Carrara to be his guest in Padua. The city had a burdensome antiquity. It was already hundreds of years old when Livy was born there in 59 B.C. It became a free commune in 1174, suffered the tyranny of Ezzelino from 1237 to 1256, recovered its independence, sang litanies to liberty, and subjected Vicenza to its domination. Attacked and almost overcome by Congrande della Scala of Verona, it abandoned its freedom and chose as dictator Jacopo I da Carrara in 1318, a man as hard as the marble that bore his name. Later members of the family succeeded to his power by inheritance or assassination. Petrarch's host seized the reins in 1345 by murdering his predecessor, tried to atone by good government, but was stabbed to death after 4 years of rule. Francesco I da Carrara, from 1350 to 1389, in a remarkable reign of almost 40 years, raised Padua to a passing rivalry with Milan, Florence, and Venice. He made the mistake of joining Genoa against Venice in the bitter war of 1378. Venice won and subjected Padua to her rule in 1404. Meanwhile, the city contributed more than its share to the cultured life of Italy. The majestic church of St. Anthony, known affectionately as Il Santo, was completed in 1307. The great Salone, or Sala della Ragione, Hall of Parliament, was repaired in 1306 by the monastic architect Fra Giovanni Eremitano, and still stands. The Regia, or Royal Palace, from 1345 and afterwards, had 400 rooms, many with frescoes that were the pride of the Carraresi. Nothing remains of them but a tower whose celebrated clock first chimed in 1364. At the beginning of the century, an ambitious merchant, Enrico Scrovegni, bought a palace in the old Roman amphitheater known as the Arena, and summoned Italy's most famous sculptor, Giovanni Pisano, and her most famous painter, Giotto, to decorate the chapel of his new home, this from 1303 to 1305. As a result, the little Arena chapel is now known throughout the educated world. Here the genial Giotto painted 100 murals, roundels, and medallions, telling again the wondrous story of the Virgin and her Son, surrounding the main frescoes with the heads of prophets and saints, and with ample female forms symbolizing the virtues and vices of mankind. Over the inner portal, his pupils, with half-hearted seriousness, depicted the Last Judgment in a carnal confusion of gargoyle-like grotesques. Mantegna, decorating a chapel in the nearby church of the Eremitani a century and a half later, may have smiled at the simple draftsmanship, the primitive perspective, the monotonous similarity of faces, poses, and figures, the imperfect sense and command of anatomy, the blonde heaviness of nearly all the figures, as if the Lombards of Padua were still Longobards freshly come from well-fed Germany. But the lovely features of the Virgin in the Nativity, the noble head of Jesus in the raising of Lazarus, the stately high priest in the Wooers, the calm Christ and coarse Judas of the Betrayal, the serene grace, harmonious composition, and developing action of the spacious panorama in color and form, make these paintings, still fresh and clear after 6 centuries, the first pictorial triumph of the 14th century. Petrarch may have seen the arena frescoes. Certainly he appreciated Giotto, for in his will he left to Francesco da Carrara a Madonna by that excellent painter Giotto, a picture whose beauty surprises the masters of the art. But at the time he was more interested in literature than in art. He must have been stimulated by hearing that Albertino Mussato, a humanist even before Petrarch, had been crowned as Padua's poet laureate in 1314 for writing a Latin drama, a Cerinius, in the style of Seneca. This, so far as we know, is the first Renaissance play. Surely Petrarch visited the university that was the city's noble pride. It was at this time the most celebrated school in Italy, rivaling Bologna as a center of legal training and Paris as a hotbed of philosophy. Petrarch was shocked by the frank Averroism of some Paduan professors, who questioned the immortality of the individual soul and spoke of Christianity as a useful superstition privately discarded by educated men. In 1348 we find our restless poet at Mantua, then at Ferrara. In 1350 he joined the flow of pilgrims bound for the Jubilee in Rome. On the way he visited Florence for the first time and established a cordial friendship with Boccaccio. Thereafter, said Petrarch, they shared a single heart. In 1351, on Boccaccio's urging, the Florentine Signory repealed the edict that had confiscated Ser Petrarcho's property and sent Boccaccio to Padua to offer Petrarch a money recompense and a professorship in the University of Florence. When he rejected the offer, Florence repealed the repeal. 6. Giotto. It is difficult to love medieval Florence. She was so hard and bitter in industry and politics, but it is easy to admire her, for she devoted her wealth to the creation of beauty. There, in the very youth of Petrarch, the Renaissance was in full swing. It developed in a stimulating atmosphere of business competition, family feuds, and private violence unparalleled in the rest of Italy. The population was divided by class war, and each class itself was split into factions, merciless in victory and vengeful in defeat. At any moment the defection of a few families from one parte to another would tip the scales of power. At any moment some discontented element might take to arms and try to oust the government. If successful, it exiled the leaders of the beaten party, usually confiscated their property, sometimes burned down their homes. But this economic strife and political agitation were not all of Florentine life. Though more devoted to their party than to their city, the citizens had a proud civic sense and spent much of their substance for the common good. Rich individuals or guilds would pay for paving a street, constructing sewers, improving the water supply, housing a public market, establishing or improving churches, hospitals, or schools. An aesthetic sense as keen as that of the ancient Greeks or the modern French dedicated public and private funds to the embellishment of the city with architecture, sculpture, and painting, and to the interior adornment of homes with these and a dozen minor arts. Florentine pottery led all Europe in this period. Florentine goldsmiths decorated necks, bosoms, hands, wrists, girdles, altars, tables, armor, coins, with jewelry or intarsia, or engraved or embossed designs unsurpassed in that or any other age. And now the artist, reflecting the new emphasis on personal ability or virtu, stood out from the guild or the group and identified his product with his name. Niccolo Pisano had already freed sculpture from limitation to ecclesiastical motives and subservience to architectural lines by uniting a sturdy naturalism with the physical idealism of the Greeks. His pupil, Andrea Pisano, cast for the Florentine baptistry from 1300 to 1306 2 bronze half-doors depicting in 28 reliefs the development of the arts and sciences since Adam delved and Eve span. These 14th-century works survive comparison with Ghiberti's 15th-century Doors to Paradise on the same building. In 1334, the Florentine Signory approved the designs of Giotto for a tower to bear the weight and scatter the chimes of the cathedral bells, and a decree was passed, in the spirit of the age, that the campanile should be built so as to exceed in magnificence, height, and excellence of workmanship everything of the kind achieved of old by the Greeks and Romans when at the zenith of their greatness. The loveliness of the tower lies not in its square and undistinguished form, which Giotto had wished to top with a spire, but in the Gothic traceried windows and the reliefs in colored marble carved on the lower panels by Giotto, Andrea Pisano, and Luca della Robbia. After Giotto's death, the work was carried on by Pisano, Donatello, and Francesco Talenti, to whom the tower owes the culminating beauty of its highest arcade, done in 1359. Giotto di Bondone dominated the painting of the 14th century as Petrarch dominated its poetry, and the artist rivaled the poet in ubiquity. Painter, sculptor, architect, capitalist, man of the world, equally ready with artistic conceptions, practical devices, and humorous repartee, Giotto moved through life with the confidence of a Rubens and spawned masterpieces in Florence, Rome, Assisi, Ferrara, Ravenna, Rimini, Faenza, Pisa, Lucca, Arezzo, Padua, Verona, Naples, Urbino, Milan. He seems never to have worried about obtaining commissions, and when he went to Naples it was as the palace guest of the king. He married and had ugly children, but this did not disturb the placid grace of his compositions or the cheerful tenor of his life. He leased looms to artisans at twice the ordinary rental. However, he told the story of St. Francis, the apostle of poverty, in one of the outstanding works of the Renaissance. He was still a youth when Cardinal Stefaneschi called him to Rome to design a mosaic, the celebrated Navicella, or Little Ship, showing Christ saving Peter from the waves. It survives, considerably altered, in the vestibule of St. Peter's, inconspicuous above and behind the portico colonnade. It was probably the same cardinal who commissioned the Polyptych, preserved in the Vatican. These products show an immature Giotto, vigorous in conception, weak in execution. Possibly a study of Pietro Cavallini's mosaics in Santa Maria in Trastevere and his fresco in Santa Cecilia helped to form Giotto in those Roman years, while the naturalistic sculpture of Niccolo Pisano may have moved him to turn his eyes from the works of his predecessors to the actual features and feelings of living men and women. Giotto appeared, said Leonardo da Vinci, and drew what he saw, and the Byzantine petrifaction faded from Italian art. Moving to Padua, Giotto painted in 3 years the famous frescoes of the Arena Chapel. Perhaps at Padua he met Dante. He may have known him in Florence. Vasari, always interesting and sometimes accurate, calls Dante the close companion and friend of Giotto, and describes to Giotto a portrait of Dante that formed part of a fresco in the Florentine Bargello, or Palace of the Podesta. The poet, with exceptional amiability, celebrates the painter in the Divine Comedy. In 1318, 2 banking families, the Bardi and the Peruzzi, engaged Giotto to tell in frescoes the stories of St. Francis, St. John the Baptist, and St. John the Evangelist in the chapels that they were dedicating in the Church of Santa Croce in Florence. These paintings were whitewashed in later years. They were uncovered in 1853 and were repainted, so that only the drawing and the composition are Giotto's. A like fate befell the celebrated frescoes in the double church of St. Francis at Assisi. That hilltop shrine is one of the major goals of pilgrimage in Italy, and those visitors who come to view the paintings attributed to Cimabue and Giotto seem as numerous as those who come to honor or solicit the saint. It was probably Giotto who planned the subjects and drew the outlines for the lower frescoes of the upper church. For the rest, he seems to have confined himself to supervising the work of his pupils. These frescoes of the upper church narrate in detail the life of St. Francis. Christ himself had rarely received so extensive a painted biography. They are masterly in their conception and composition, pleasant in their gentle mood and flowing harmony. They end once and for all the hieratic stiffness of Byzantine forms. But they lack depth and force and individuality. They are graceful tableaus, without the color of passion or the blood of life. The frescoes in the lower church, less mangled by time, mark an advance in Giotto's power. He seems to have been directly responsible for the pictures in the Magdalen Chapel, while his aides painted the allegories illustrating the Franciscan vows of poverty, obedience, and chastity. In this duplex church, the legend of Francis gave a mighty stimulus, almost a new birth, to Italian painting, and generated a tradition ideally completed in the work of the Dominican Fra Angelico. All in all, Giotto's work was a revolution. We feel his faults because we know of the painting skills that were developed by the movement that he began. His drawing, modeling, perspective, and anatomy are painfully inadequate. Art, like the medical science of Giotto's time, was just beginning to dissect the human body, to learn the place, structure, and function of each muscle, bone, tendon, nerve. Men like Mantegna and Masaccio would master these elements, and Michelangelo would perfect them, almost make a fetish of them. But in Giotto's day it was still unusual to study, scandalous to represent, the nude. What is it, then, that makes the work of Giotto in Padua and Assisi a landmark in the history of art? It is the rhythmic composition, drawing the eye from every angle to the center of interest, the dignity of quiet motion, the soft and luminous coloring, the majestic flow of the narrative, the restraint of expression even in deep feeling, the grandeur of the calm that bathes these troubled scenes. And now and then, the naturalistic portraiture of men, women, and children, not as studied in past art, but as seen and felt in the movement of life. These were the components of Giotto's triumph over Byzantine rigidity and gloom. These were the secrets of his enduring influence. For a century after him, Florentine art lived on his example and his inspiration. In his wake came two generations of Giotteschi, who imitated his themes and style, but rarely touched his excellence. His godson and pupil, Taddeo Gaddi, almost inherited art. Taddeo's father and three of Taddeo's 5 sons were painters. The Italian Renaissance, like German music, tended to run in families and prospered there through the transmission and accumulation of techniques in homes, studios, and schools. Taddeo began as an apprentice to Giotto. By 1347 he was at the head of Florentine painters. Even then, however, he signed himself devotedly Discepolo di Giotto il buon maestro. He became so rich through his industry as painter and architect that his descendants could afford to be patrons of art. An impressive work long attributed to him but now ascribed to Andrea da Firenze shows how, in this first century of the Renaissance, Italy was still medieval. In the Cappella degli Spagnuoli, or Chapel of the Spaniards, in the church of Santa Maria Novella, the Dominican friars set up about 1370 a pictorial apotheosis of their famous philosopher. St. Thomas Aquinas, comfortably substantial but too devoted to be proud, stands in triumph, with the heretics Arius, Sabellius, and Averroes groveling at his feet. Around him Moses, Paul, John the Evangelist, and other saints seem but accessories. Below them 14 figures symbolize 7 sacred and 7 profane sciences: Donatus, grammar; Cicero, rhetoric; Justinian, law; Euclid, geometry, and so on. The thought is still completely medieval. Only the art, in design and color, shows the emergence of a new age from the old. The transition was so gradual that not for a century yet would men feel themselves to be in a different world. The advance in technique is clearer in Orcagna, who stands second only to Giotto among the Italian artists of the 14th century. Named originally Andrea di Cione, he was called Arcagnolo, Archangel, by his admiring contemporaries, and lazy tongues shortened the appellation to Orcagna. Although often listed among Giotto's followers, he was rather a pupil of the sculptor Andrea Pisano. Like the greatest geniuses of the Renaissance, he was a master of many arts. As a painter, he made a colorful altarpiece of Christ enthroned for the Strozzi Chapel in Santa Maria Novella, while his elder brother Nardo executed on the walls vivid frescoes of heaven and hell, these from 1354 to 1357. As an architect, he designed the Certosa, or Carthusian monastery near Florence, famous for its graceful cloisters and its Acciaiuoli tombs. As architects and sculptors, he and his brother executed the ornate tabernacle in the Oratory San Michele in Florence. A picture of the Virgin there was believed to work miracles. After the Black Death of 1348, the votive offerings of survivors enriched the fraternity that managed the building, and it was decided to house the picture in a sumptuous shrine of marble and gold. The Cioni designed it as a miniature Gothic cathedral, with columns, pinnacles, statues, reliefs, precious metal, and costly stone. It is a jewel of Trecento decoration. The Italians call the 14th century Trecento, 300, the 15th century Quattrocento, 400, the 16th century Cinquecento, etc. Andrea, acclaimed for it, was appointed capo maestro at Orvieto and shared in designing the facade of the cathedral. In 1362 he returned to Florence and worked there on the great Duomo till his death. The immense fame of Santa Maria del Fiore, the largest church that had as yet been built in Italy, had been begun by Arnolfo di Cambio in 1296. A succession of masters, Giotto, Andrea Pisano, Francesco Talenti, and many others, labored on it till our time. Its present facade dates from 1887. Even now the cathedral is incomplete and must in good measure be rebuilt by every century. Architecture was the least successful of the arts in Renaissance Italy. It took half-heartedly from the north some elements of Gothic, like the pointed arch, combined them with classic columns, and sometimes, as in Florence, topped the whole with a Byzantine dome. The mixture was incongruous and, barring some small churches by Bramante, lacked unity and grace. The facade of Orvieto and Siena were superb displays of sculpture and mosaic rather than honest architecture, and the accentuation of horizontal lines by the alternating strata of black and white marble in the walls depresses eye and soul, when the very meaning of the church should have been a prayer or paean rising to the skies. Santa Maria del Fiore, as the Florentine cathedral was called after 1412, from the lily and the heraldic emblem of the city, is hardly a flower. It is, but for Brunellesco's illustrious dome, a cavern, whose dark vacuity might be the mouth of Dante's Inferno instead of a vestibule to God. It was the inexhaustible Arnolfo di Cambio who, in 1294, began the Franciscan Church of Santa Croce, or the Holy Cross, and in 1298 the loveliest structure in Florence, the Palazzo della Signoria, known to later generations as the Palazzo Vecchio. The church was finished in 1442, except for the facade, this in 1863. The Palace of the Signory, or Old Palace, was completed in its main features by 1314. Those were the years that saw the banishment of Dante and Petrarch's father. Factional strife was in its heyday. So Arnolfo built for the Signory a fortress rather than a palace, and designed its roof with machicolated battlements, while the unique campanile, by the diverse ringing of its bell, served to call the citizens to Parliament or to arms. Here the city fathers, priori, signori, not only governed but lived, and the temper of the time appears in the law that during their 2 months of office they were not to leave the building on any pretext whatever. In 1345, Neri di Fioravante spanned the Arno with one of the world's famous bridges, the Ponte Vecchio, now cracked with age and many wars, but still precariously bearing impatient traffic and 22 shops. Around these proud achievements of the Florentine civic spirit, in the narrow streets that led from the cathedral and Signoria squares, rose the as yet modest mansions of the worried rich, the noble churches that transmuted merchants' gold into art, the noisy shops of traders and artisans, and the crowded tenements of an industrious, rebellious, excitable, intelligent populace. In that frenzy of egos, the Renaissance was born. 7. The Decameron. It was in Florence that Italian literature achieved its first and greatest triumphs. There, Guinizelli and Cavalcanti, in the late 13th century, gave the sonnet its finished form. Not there, but longing for it, Dante the Florentine struck the first and last true note of Italian epic poetry. There Boccaccio composed the supreme work of Italian prose, and Giovanni Villani wrote the most modern of medieval chronicles. Visiting Rome for the Jubilee of 1300, and moved, like Gibbon, by the ruins of a mighty past, Villani thought for a while of recording its history. Then, judging that Rome had been sufficiently commemorated, he turned back to his native haunts and resolved to bring into this volume all the events of the city of Florence, and give in full the deeds of the Florentines, and briefly the notable affairs of the rest of the world. He began with the Tower of Babel and ended on the verge of the Black Death, in which he died. His brother Matteo and his nephew Filippo continued the story to 1365. Giovanni was well prepared. He came of a prosperous mercantile family, commanded a pure Tuscan speech, traveled in Italy, Flanders, and France, served thrice as prior and once as master of the mint. He had, for those times, an uncommon sense of the economic bases and influences of history, and he was the first to salt his narrative with statistics of social conditions. The first 3 books of his Croniche Fiorentine are mostly legend, but in later books we learn that in 1338 Florence and its hinterland had 105,000 inhabitants, of whom 17,000 were beggars and 4,000 were on public relief, that there were 6 primary schools, teaching 10,000 boys and girls, and 4 high schools, in which 600 boys and a few girls studied grammar, literature, and logic, philosophy. Unlike most historians, Villani included notices of new books, paintings, buildings. Seldom has a city been so directly described in all the departments of its life. Had Villani brought all these phases and details into one united narrative of causes, phenomena, personalities, and effects, he would have transformed his chronicle into history. Settling down in Florence in 1340, Boccaccio continued to pursue woman in life and verse and prose. The Amorosa Visione was dedicated to Fiammetta, and recalled in 4,400 lines of terza rima the happier days of their liaison. In a psychological novel, Fiammetta, the bastard princess is made to tell the story of her deviation with Boccaccio. She analyzes the emotions of love, the torments of desire and jealousy and desertion, in Richardsonian detail. And when her conscience rebukes her infidelity, she imagines Aphrodite chiding her for cowardice. Make not thyself so timorous in saying, I have a husband, and holy laws and promised faith forbid me these things. These are but vain conceits and frivolous objections against the power of Eros. For like a strong and mighty prince he plants his eternal laws. Not caring for other laws of lower state, he accounts them base and servile rules. Boccaccio, abusing the power of the pen, ends the book by having Fiammetta proclaim to his glory that it was he who deserted her, not she who deserted him. Returning to poetry, he sang in the Ninfale Fiessolano the love of a shepherd for a priestess of Diana. His triumph is described in fond detail, with some enthusiasm spared for natural scenery. This is almost the working formula of the Decameron. It was shortly after the plague of 1348 that Boccaccio began to write this renowned concatenation of seductive tales. This book is continued on Cassette 2, Side 1.